Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, I was thinking about the future state of Last Epoch in terms of the trading economy that's going to be introduced with the Merchants Guild faction, and I was doing a lot of research for that, and I realized the only game that's anywhere near similar to that kind of economy is Path of Exile. Now, of course, I have been playing Last Epoch for the past 4 years. I still play PoE every so often, but I am definitely what you would call a biased gamer here in this regard. So I have actually brought someone on this time around to assist me with this topic of how is trade going to be in Last Epoch 1.0 by looking through the lens and talking about it through Path of Exile, right? And today we have Sirgog with me. Go ahead, Sirgog, introduce yourself.
Hi, Dread. Yes, so I've been playing Path of Exile since 2013, casually maybe from 2013 to 2017, and a lot more since then. And I've also played a number of other games where I've been more of a economy warrior, like EVE Online in particular, and also games like Dungeons and Dragons Online back before that went as pay to cheat as it is now, and also played World of Warcraft and a number of other things. So you sort of see a bunch of different examples of the ways that in-game economies are structured, and there's definitely big differences to all of them.
All right, perfect. And the main reason that I'm bringing you on is because you have literally zero to no experience with Last Epoch. I chose you on purpose for that because I
That's
want
correct.
you to look at these kind of questions and this kind of economy that Ellie is shaping up to be in the Path of Exile lens so we can figure out what is it going to be like. So let's get into those questions, shall we? All right, so to give some context for this first question, there was recently an interview with the developers of Path of Exile 2 where they mentioned a few things, including Last Epoch in terms of economy. Do you want to just boil that down real quick for layman's terms, Mr. Sirgog?
Yeah, all right. So the core concepts that Harishi and Jonathan outlined there were that they're very concerned that if you have a completely frictionless economy, i.e., it's very trivial to trade with whoever you want, and there's basically no limitations on it, then this creates an environment that is extremely favorable to the very top players at the expense of everyone else, where essentially there's items that are undersupplied across the economy become extremely expensive and pretty much everything else becomes worthless, which means that if you take, for instance, in Path of Exile, three of the most desirable items at the moment are Original Sin, Mage Blood, and Headhunter. And you would see a situation where the ratio of the values of these items to things that are more casual player accessible that you could conceivably farm yourself, the ratio becomes larger and larger. And that's because there's so many hand-me-downs going around. Path of Exile's experimented with a number of things to try and address this over time, and they've just never really quite gotten it right. But this league was really extreme in Path of Exile, where there was just huge fountains of currency everywhere, and you had this really bizarre economy where essentially items that are way too rare for a casual player to ever expect to find them became massively oversupplied in the economy. So, for those of you that have a bit of knowledge of Path of Exile, the Squire comes to mind. The Squire is an item that was intended originally as a chase item. It's as rare as Headhunter and Mageblood are, but it's just never taken off quite as much in popularity. But it's widely regarded as a good item, and it was just incredibly cheap this league because there were just so many of them floating around.
And so many
Now,
divines too, right?
so many divines as well. But if you compare to things that weren't in larger supply than usual, like tainted oils, normally a squire might trade for maybe anywhere from 25 to 50 tainted oils, and this league it was one squire trading for two tainted oils at a period. And this is something that you can target farm, but requires you to just jump outside the normal Path of Exile gameplay loop and do some specific content that can only really generate that loot. And so there's a whole lot of things like that that were going berserk. So that's what happens when you've got a lot of extra items in the economy. But then you have the question of what happens when you've got more accessibility of trade. And one of the key things that comes up is that the fact that it's a hassle to trade items means that when medium value items drop for veteran players, they often don't pick them up. And I'll take as a case in point, this is a Path of Exile specific one. There's an item called Divination Distillate in Path of Exile. Not a chase item by any means, but it's not one of the most common items in the game. And when you pick this up and you identify it, it has a 1 in 55 chance of having perfect rolls on it. And if you get one with perfect rolls, it's worth quite a bit. If you get one that's 1 point off perfect, it ends up being worth quite a modest amount, at least for a casual player anyway. And then if you get anything that's less than the top 2 rolls, it tends to just not sell. Or if it sells at a price that's a hassle to process the trade for. So, if you got one that was, say, 11% on the scale, it goes from 8 to 12, and that is 26% on the scale, it goes from 20 to 30. This is an above average roll, but people are still not going to be interested in actually leaving a map in order to do a trade.
Yeah, that's the
That
innate friction. Yeah,
is that it adds the fact that you have this 1 minute chore you need to do every time you carry out a trade means that veteran players stop doing those trades at all.
yep,
Casual players will still do them, but veteran players won't. And this means that essentially it's a decrease to the amount of these items that drop for veteran players because they don't pick them up.
exactly. Yeah. So now with the rest of this interview here, there was a specific part of the interview where they were talking about how, like, well, we kind of need to get with the times per se. We can't really have like this old trade system, right? Like they were talking about. And now we got to like work with people to get a new system out there that the new audience, quote unquote, would be accepting, right? So like why do people not like the current version of Path of Exile trade? Like why do they not enjoy it right now, and why are people excited for other trade systems that are coming through, right?
So there's a few main reasons here. The first one is, let's take the seller's perspective. Every time you want to sell an item that you've had a lucky drop in your map and you want to sell it to another player, you have to interrupt what you're doing, and that's frustrating. It's a frustrating experience to actually carry out the trade. This is massively amplified if you're running content where it's not easily interrupted. So, for instance, if you're mapping using the unique belt headhunter, you build up a lot of momentum during your maps, and getting a ping from someone saying, "Hey, I want to trade for this item," is really frustrating when you then lose all of that momentum, and it can take you 60 seconds to rebuild that even after you do the transaction. Or if you're running content like the Eternal Labyrinth or the Enriched Eternal Labyrinths in Path of Exile, these are things you can't leave without conceding a failure for that run. And so that ends up being even more extreme. So there's a number of factors where it's really frustrating as a seller. However, as a buyer, it's even worse. And that's because bad actors can really aggressively abuse Path of Exile's market friction in order to mislead people. To take an example of this, we take an item that is fairly liquid and easily sold. And here, my pricing might be a couple of weeks old on this, but a Locus of Corruption Elva Temple was 6.2 divines the last time I sold one. I'm not sure what they are now, but that's something that they used to be worth. And you don't need to know what this particular item is for it to matter. Just know that it's an endgame consumable that people who are not power gamers are never interested in buying, but that casual players can make with determined effort. And if you've got one of these and you list it for sale at 6.2 divines, you'll get a ping reasonably quickly. But what you'll find is that there'll be a number of them that are listed for 4 divines, and these will be entirely bad faith listings. There's no intention to sell the item. The person is simply listing them there in order to deceive other players into thinking the item is worth less than it is.
Yeah, price fixing.
Yeah, price fixing is what it's generally referred to by the Path of Exile player base. It's sort of, I always think of price fixing as being more something I did a bit in EVE Online, where you would coordinate with other players to try and artificially move
Manipulate the market.
interest in
Yeah.
something. Like an example of what might be more close to price fixing in my mind, it would be, for instance, if me and 3 other players decided, right, what we're going to do is push up the value of Light Neutron Blaster 2s, try and push them to 1.25 million, ISK. Yeah, I'm not sure what they're worth now because I haven't played Eve for years, but back at that point, you could just buy out everything under that price, but you would also need to try and drive some organic demand for them. And so you'd often actually run a player run event that would be a mass consumer of them. But before you announced it, you would then buy up the whole market. So I always think of that as price fixing and generally refer to it as a bad faith listing if someone posts something with no intention to sell. But yeah, most Path of Exile players will use that term. It's just
So
what
mainly the friction of the trade system and the price fixing is what most people dislike currently, right?
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. They're the biggest concerns people will have about it. It's that it's frustrating. It interrupts your gameplay loop when you want to trade, and especially because you're often trading for consumables you want in bulk. I don't think people really mind that much if they're trading for their dream sword on their character.
Yeah.
They don't really mind having a lot of friction for that trade because even if you eventually replace that item, it's going to be something that's a big exciting moment to get it, and you don't
Yeah.
mind doing five
Yeah,
minutes
but
of
if I
risk.
want some scours, it's going to be a pain in the ass.
Correct. Yes, yes, very annoying.
Perfect. So, speaking of that interview that we mentioned earlier, one of the main games they brought up in that discussion mentioned earlier, last Epoch, in that game, the economy is going to be a little bit different for better or for worse. The only problem is PoE is the only game on the market that has an economy that is anywhere near close to it that we can study, right? And since your experience with the PoE economy, I wanted to ask you a few questions regarding PoE's trade if we lived in a alternate universe and these were the cases. And the first one is with Last Epoch, items are not going to be retradable. When you buy an item, it's going to be soulbound to you, much like Diablo. But once you buy the item, it will be soulbound to you once you buy it. And my question is, what would be the potential downsides and upsides if that was the case in Path of Exile? Like, what would be the problem? What would be the benefits, right?
Yeah, okay, so one of the key things this does is it essentially destroys a lot of items that players deem worthwhile to equip. So a whole bunch of items that players are excited to get their hands on become consumables, long-term consumables. It's not like, a scarab in Path of Exile where it's gone after one map, but there's something that you don't throw back into the economy afterwards. Essentially, this means that things like leveling oriented uniques would feel much rarer than they are now, unless the drop rates are massively increased to compensate for it. And I particularly talk here, again, this is one of those things where some of you viewers may have played Path of Exile, some of you may not. But to give you two examples of leveling uniques, there's one called Goldrum that is relatively common, and there's one that's called Seven League Steps that is much better and also quite a bit rarer. And Seven League Steps is a sort of item that would be very, very scarce. It would become an expensive luxury to use Seven League Step in this setup, whereas Goldrum endgame players will still find a lot of them. So essentially, you're removing a lot of items from the economy that players deem worthy of equipping. This is then going to have flow on effects. Nowadays, you're not going to have as many second-hand items being passed down. Once a veteran player gets, they get their day one weapon, which might actually be another player's day 15 dream weapon. Well, now it's not their day 15 dream weapon because it's just going to get essentially deleted once it's no longer being used. Now, going for binds to character on trade through the auction house is a little bit different because items essentially have two lives with that. They've got the life for their original user, if that original user still wants the item, and then they get a second life, but it's close to just simply destroying the item once it's been equipped
Yep,
once.
removing it from the economy. Now, what do you think that's going to have effects on certain items, like let's say chase items, like for instance, like headhunters, mage blood, stuff like that? Because when they get removed from the economy, well, if someone else wants a mage blood, guess what? Someone's going to have to drop one again so that they can have the ability to buy that, right? What do you think is going to happen there?
Okay, with chase items, I think it's less significant because it's not like all that many people start with a headhunter, then upgrade to a better rolled headhunter. They might upgrade their own headhunter through the use of applying divine orbs to it, And that's something that I don't know if there's an equivalent in Last Epoch,
Not
a way
really.
to use an extremely rare reagent
Yeah,
to upgrade an existing unique. But you might do that a little bit more. But basically speaking, you, the people who are destroying headhunters at the moment, or especially mage bloods and original sins, are doing it through things like the double corruption chamber, which they know is a super super rare thing to use. I just think it's going to have a pretty minimal impact on the chase items. Where it will have a massive impact is the second tier rarity items. And here I'd like to call out a couple of examples that, again, Path of Exile players in your community will know. Diala's Malefaction, which wasn't chase until 3.19 but got a massive buff and now is a chase item. And also you have things like Doriani's Prototype, Arakali's Fang,
so it's rare
Shimon's
but
Wrappings
niche
popular
items,
now.
right?
Yeah, but all of these items are genuinely very rare, but they're not at the level of Headhunter or Mage Blood. These items, the more niche they are, the more people will just go, I'll get one and I'll stick to it. But if it's an all-around generally good item of the same rarity, like Martyr of Innocence, which granted very off-meta item at the moment, but was once really good. Um, if you have an item like that that's just all-around good but not staggeringly rare, I guess Defiance of Destiny would be another Path of Exile item at the moment that's like that. These items could well end up in a really messy situation where they'll feel much, much, much rarer.
Yeah, they'll end up just becoming way more expensive because the ones at the market, they'll be like, hey, I can sell this for more because there's no others, right? Because of the fact that it's so like wanted.
That's correct. Also, items with large roll ranges, which again, I'm not sure if that's so much of a
That
factor in
is
Path
that is a factor in Last Epoch, yes.
in Last Epoch. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So items with large roll ranges will be another example of something where, if someone's got a top 5% roll on an item, but they're rich, they might want to upgrade to a top 0.1% version of the item. And now their top 5% one will still be desired potentially by someone unless the item's quite common, and then it's effectively destroyed. So what you're seeing here is that there's always a tendency towards items being like towards the very best items becoming more expensive and the middle tier stuff becoming less expensive. I think this will actually slow down that tendency a bit because there'll be more demand for the sort of top 20% but not top 5% versions of an item because so many of them are getting destroyed.
Perfect. Now, to continue on this discussion, another question regarding the previous one: what would PoE's economy be like if we eventually had an auction house? I recently myself have played a lot of Torchlight Infinite, which already has an auction house when it was released, but it is actually very similar to Path of Exile because it was kind of like made after Path of Exile. And in the first few seasons of that game, the market ended up becoming an absolute hellscape of very expensive chase items due to an insane flipping meta because you could buy and sell back, right? And almost worthless items just dropping constantly. You never felt like as though you dropped anything good, right? Because with the flipping being so easy with the market, right? Now, uh, that was just insane with the inflation. Now, do you think that's like one of the main reasons why Pee-wee has avoided an auction house this whole time, or do you think there are other reasons?
Okay, I think the main reason Path of Exile avoided an auction house is Diablo 3. Diablo 3 started with two auction houses. One of them was in game currency, one of them was a pay to cheat, real world money type RMT auction house. But even let's ignore the RMT one and just deal with the one that used in game gold. This ended up distorting the way that items drop within that game so much that eventually Diablo 3 had to remove it entirely. And that was something that players didn't like at the time, even though most people thought that the overall package of changes they made the game better. So I think that Path of Exile's attitude has been, we can't add this and then later remove it. So we aren't going to add it unless we're sure we can do it right. And we're just not sure we can do it right. What would happen if you have an auction house? Like you said, there'll be a flipping meta, and there's a whole bunch of ways you can try and address it. But essentially, having low friction trade empowers two types of players: the most knowledgeable slash market shark type people, and also bot cheaters. It empowers these at the expense of the rest of the player base because it increases their dominance of the economy. Now, some people will be fine with that package. Some people that don't fit either category of bot cheaters or market sharks will still prefer a game where they have less of a market share overall, but they have less friction as well. They might think that it's a worthwhile sacrifice, but Grinding Games' opinion is that it isn't the case. One of the things you mentioned there is the flipping meta. There's a number of ways games have addressed flipping in the past. For example, World of Warcraft, at least the time I played, had I think it was a 1% listing tax and a 5% sales proceeds tax. Dungeons and Dragons Online went 30% on
Ooh,
the sales proceeds tax. And also, EVE Online had a smaller version
yeah.
of that.
Even
So
Torchlight
there's a number.
introduced their own tax later on as well.
Yeah, and that's something that games learn really is really essential because it concentrates and centralizes wealth. That's one of the key things an auction house does. It's convenient, but it then concentrates wealth in the economy, centralizes it on fewer and fewer people. And this means that those people then have more currency to throw around for the things they personally are interested in. And so you end up with a very, very messy economy. Like in the real world, this would be seen as just increasing inequality and and all of the things that go along with that. In a game, inequality doesn't matter as much as it does in real life
It's
because
more
there's no.
like just like the difference between like a casual and like a person who like plays a lot, right? That's like the
Yeah, optimized
inequality there.
an optimized player's hour of play, it increases the number of hours that a casual gamer needs to play in order to match the in-game accomplishments of the optimized player. So in Path of Exile, for instance, this league's an extreme outlier, but if we take, say, 3.22 as an example, an optimized in-game player might have been generating 6 divine orbs an hour, whereas a casual player might be generating 1 divine orb per 3 hours. So you've got this 18-to-1 ratio going on. Now, this league, it's not 18-to-1. This league, it's more
Yeah.
like 50-to-1 or 100-to-1, but that's an outlier. Um, the more that you empower the people who are auction house focused, the wider this gulf becomes.
Yeah. Now, like, so the biggest thing I find with this is the biggest argument is, well, I want my trading to be easier, right? That's like usually the argument. It's like, hey, I don't care if the economy is fucked, or I don't like, or they just don't understand the problems with easier trading, right? How would you go about uh, telling someone about how like an easier trading experience or economy or whatever would cause those kind of problems you're listing off, and how would you explain how that would affect them in the long?
It's not really something that you can have the same discussion with people about because it varies as to their own experience level.
Yeah.
For instance, there'll be players who in Path of Exile don't aspire to acquiring one of the main chase items, the headhunters or the mage bloods and the like, and as a result they're not really affected by some of the inflation that those items have sometimes experienced, or sometimes a deflation this league that they've experienced. So that's one factor. The key thing I think is worth saying is what should the ratio be between optimized play and casual play in terms of rewards? Ask them that, and then point out just how much an auction house widens
Like,
that
yeah, it
gap.
just makes a chasm in comparison, right?
But sometimes, like people can be quite happy with a chasm sometimes too.
Yeah,
It's not like it is
because it gives them a
necessarily.
reward for becoming that optimized player, right? Essentially.
Yeah, if they aspire to become an optimized player, it's that there's that, or even just something that they might aspire towards in the future,
Yeah.
or they might be in awe of players that are better than themselves at the game and think that they deserve everything because they're so much better. The way that like you or me might be in awe of an Olympic athlete and think, oh
Hmm.
wow, that person's absolutely amazing, or whatever.
So,
So that
yeah. Oh, I said, so in that case, what would you tell the person who just wants to have like a faster, more like quick and easy trade experience? Like, what would you tell them about this kind of thing? Like, what would be your response to that? Like, hey, like I just want trade to be like feel good, like much better. I just want to be able to click a button and have the item in my inventory. Like, what would you tell them in that regard?
I think that you can make the game better with making that the case for things that are consumables. If you have it be the case for permanent items, then what you're doing is you're creating a situation where Mr. 10 Mirrors on day 3 of the league can just outbid them on everything and can grind their buying power into the dust. They can just go, right, I'm going to crush your ability to buy this item by buying everything that comes up in that niche first. And in that sense, it's a lot of the way in which, you see in the real world, where the more money that people who are upper middle class have to throw around on housing, the more difficult it is for someone that's not upper middle class to get their foot in the door at all, because they can just outbid the first home buyer all the time. You get that sort of thing happening in the game as well. And one of the things that prevents that from being the case is that there's a force multiplier effect, and there's I guess maybe a force divider is the opposite of that. It's a force divider that every trade takes a certain amount of time in
Yeah.
Path of Exile at the moment. There are other ways to do this, and I think that the Path of Exile 2 ideas that have been thought about are actually better than the Path of Exile 1 system. But the key thing is that if you don't throttle the top 0.01% of the player economy,
If you don't like give them essentially like a cooldown to their trading, right? In this regard.
yeah, yeah, if you don't do something to minimize their capacity to basically fully
Limit their
pick that apart
potential actions, I think would
faster.
be a good way. Like
Oh, what, sorry?
I mean like limit their potential actions per hour or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Limiting their actions per hour is a good way of putting it. And one of the things that I've thought of would be a really positive thing in Path of Exile would be having a system where when you sell an item, you don't receive the currency that the buyer paid, but you instead receive an incubator that you then have to go and kill a certain number of monsters in order to in order to have that mature, and then you receive the
Yeah.
rewards from it. So you sell an item, say for 4 divine orbs, maybe you then have to go and kill 20,000 monsters before you actually get those 4 divine orbs in a way that you can then use them. And that's just a tiny nuisance if you're a casual player that gets a lucky drop, goes around and sells it. But it's a huge impact
You're
if you're
trying to
someone
do
who.
hundreds of trades per hour, all of a sudden it's going to take forever.
Exactly, exactly. And I think the Path of Exile 2 trading system that Jonathan and Harishi outlined in that interview that you started talking about is an example of something where it's not the same solution I'd come up with, but it captures the same thing. If you
Yeah.
aren't killing monsters, you hit a throttle on your trading
Yeah.
capacity. But if you are killing monsters, then you should be able to just power through that limit.
So last epoch's potential, last epoch's solution to this, at least what they're planning on doing, is they're making it so that not only do you have to pay for items in gold, but to list an item on the market, you have to pay a potential favor cost, which is favor you get with the faction as you kill enemies and do things for the faction. So you still have to do those physical things, but instead of like getting the reward and having to open it up to even put the thing on the market, you gotta like at least have a little bit of favor, right? Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's also sounds like a like something that's being done in order to attack bot cheats. I
exactly.
would
Yeah,
assume last epoch being buy to play, you would have less of a bot cheating issue than Path of Exile can get at times, and
exactly.
expect that will continue to be the case. But even then, yeah, that's something that strikes me as a straight up attack on bot cheating.
Perfect. Now, the last question to bundle everything that we just talked about, like everything, the interview, the potential questions I gave you. Now, the last question is if both the item retradability being non existent and you had an auction house at the same time, how would that affect PoE's economy and in what ways? What do you think would be the potential problems, potential things that would be good about this system?
Okay, so I want to start with one thing that is important to talk about with Path of Exile is that it's common to have a multi-step trade in a way where you find a particularly desirable base on the ground. So if we take an example from the current game, maybe you get really lucky and you find a focused amulet, which is one of the most chase base items in the game. Then you trade that to me. I then craft it into something and then on sell it to another player. This is something that would be completely destroyed by having items become bind to account on going through the auction house once. For that reason, I think that players would probably need to learn more crafting themselves. And Path of Exile's crafting can be extremely, extremely complex. Or alternately, players would need to, when they find something that's a particularly rare ingredient in a trade, maybe when they find something that's a rare item on the ground, like a base or something like that, they may need to do the entire process and make it into a finished item themselves. It's not really something where you can say, all right, I'm going to be the person who buys the focused amulets from one player, then B splits them, then does a little bit of basic crafting, but leave the advanced
Yeah.
stuff to someone else.
Yeah, you have like much less like market niches, right? Where you're like, I'm going to be the person that does this, but you can't do that anymore because those kind of like niches are quote unquote the middleman, right, between the player that drops the item versus you making the item, and then the player that wants said item, right? So now it's just there's no middleman anymore.
Correct, yeah. So that's going to be something that would be absolutely transformative on Path of Exile's economy. And that's going to have flow on effects everywhere and will particularly mean that people who know a lot of broad sections of crafting, like if you have a broad knowledge of crafting rather than a very narrow one, it would favor that. For a bit of an example here, one of the things I've done in previous leagues, and when I've wanted to be a bit more economy focused than I have this league, I'll find a particularly popular guide and I'll look for a confusing step in it. And one of the best examples of this would be in Path of Exile 3.22 era and earlier Righteous Fire guides. There was an outstanding guide that was put out by a content creator called Pox, but at one point, he just says create an influence Stygian Vice, and the exact mechanics of how to do that cheaply aren't discussed. So I would mass produce this step. I would find this one step that wasn't explained that well, and I would mass produce the finished product from that step, and then I would go ahead and sell them. In this sense, I had top 1% knowledge of one particular area of the game, which was crafting with influence and harvest, but I didn't necessarily know where people were going from there. I had a vague sense, but what people would be doing after that was something that, people who were more experienced with Righteous Fire builds than me would know more about. So my very, very narrow knowledge, where I was an expert in one small specific section of the game on Tiny Slice, was something I was able to make a lot of currency out of. Whereas under the situation that Last Epoch's moving towards, that sort of specificity is not rewarded anymore.
Yeah,
Instead,
like
you need.
if you're really good at something, it's not going to matter. But you need to be good at a bunch of different things, right?
Correct, yeah. You're going to need to know a lot. The other thing is that there may just simply be less demand for extreme wealth in general in the game. And that's something you'd have to see how it plays out. But it may be that there's less goals that people have that are that take 100 hours for an experienced player to acquire enough currency to pull off. So that's something that you'd have to see how it plays out, whether people are still interested, for instance, in trading for a Mage Blood when that Mage Blood becomes bound to either their character or their account after they've acquired it. And even though a lot of people just get the item and then never trade it away, the capacity to trade it away does have some value in a lot of people's mind. So that's another factor that's going to be there.
Perfect. So I have a surprise question for you. This is
Fire
going to
away.
be, I just thought of it, and this is very important. And I brought this up recently with my friends and I. We were talking about MG. And the biggest thing that we realize with Merchant's Guild, which is the trading system that we're explaining here, the problem that we're going to have, and a lot of people, especially casual people, are going to have, or inexperienced players, is they are going to like try something. Like in Path of Exile, a good example of this is like imagine if someone saw Pox's Righteous Fire video, and they're like, "Hey, I like this. I like the idea of this build." They buy all the items, they craft everything, and they play it. And they're like, I don't actually like it." Now in Path of Exile, you'd be able to sell those items and at least recoup some of the cost. But in this Merchant's Guild system, if you did that, you're going to get screwed. So not only does that put more pressure onto people who make content to make sure that that content is good and is easily readable, right? And like you can't make mistakes here. Like the inexperienced players, if they're looking for guides, they're going to be a lot more like picky and very you know, very like like I don't know a way of putting it. Like what do you think is do you think that do you think that would happen in this situation?
So you're saying more concentration and centralization on particular guides that have been widely positively reviewed by the community as a result of this,
Yeah,
because yeah.
because if you
Uh,
choose a bad guide and it sucks and you hate it, or if anything, not even just a bad guide, just something you don't like we all can make mistakes. Or like I look at like something in the store and I buy it and I eat it or whatever and I don't like it. I'm like, well, like or whatever. Or like I buy, I don't know. I'm trying to like think of like a good example in real life. Like let's
yeah,
say I
just
buy
buyers
a
remove.
car, right? I buy a car and I don't like the car. I can sell the car afterwards and recoup the cost of me buying the car. In last epoch, you're going to buy that car and then you're never going to be able to sell it ever again. It's going to be stuck with you. And is that going to cause a lot of buyer's remorse? Is that going to make people feel bad, salty? Like, what do you think?
Okay, this is one where I'm answering this as an Eve player, or for lapsed
Mm,
Eve player anyway, rather than a Path of Exile one, because I think in Eve there's a lot more item destruction than there is in Path of Exile, and so
because the
people can
ships can blow
often.
up.
Correct. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Basically, everything in Eve's a consumable, even if it doesn't look like it's a consumable. And one of the rules that Eve players had is never undock something you can't afford to lose. I think you might start seeing something develop along those lines where it's like never throw more than 60% of your league wealth into a particular build until you're sure you like it, until you're sure it's doing what you wanted it to do. And that's probably going to be the sort of advice that I would give out
Yeah.
following this. Make sure that you've got a fallback plan in case it turns out that this latest and greatest build is actually not a good fit for you, or is actually neither the latest nor the greatest. It's just something you feel it's a complete and utter failure.
Yeah, and like a good example here, right? Imagine if someone has been working towards like a headhunter for like days and days and days, or however long they end up doing that, right? And they buy said headhunter with these new trading rules that we discussed. And then they play with the headhunter and they dislike it. Well, they just wasted like a week of their time trying to achieve an item that they didn't even enjoy in the end. Do you think that like that's going to cause a lot of like burnout? It's going to cause a lot of people just being annoyed, or like what do you think that's going to cause?
I do think it's plausible to see burnout as a result of that, although there's always going to be
Yeah,
things that's going to come up for. For example, in Path of Exile at the moment, it's easy to sink a lot of currency into a crafting attempt and either get unlucky and fail it, or create something that, even though you succeed in your goals, doesn't really have any resale
yeah.
value.
So do you think that like crafting, that's just going to make it so less people want to interact with the system or interact with those items because of that? Or do you think it's just going to make people just more generally like just like this mentality where they just don't want to interact with it because they could potentially lose something, even though that the item could be really good in this case, or in this case, like crafting would be good, right? But they don't want to interact with it because there is a potential failure. Like, what do you think of that?
I think one of the biggest things that's going to come up will be the extremely rare items that are not universally powerful. For example, like we've talked a bit about Headhunter and Mageblood as two of the rarest Path of Exile items that are just universally good on pretty much any build. I think it'll be more of an impact on items like the Squire, which is an item that does not fit many builds at all, is equally rare with Headhunter and Mageblood, and is extremely good in narrow niches, but does not work in other contexts. That's going to be the sort of item that's going to be really, really affected by this. Things that are very much one build items, and you would know more than me whether
Yeah,
Last Epoch is one of
there's
those.
plenty of those in the last epoch. Trust me.
So
But
if you
yeah,
have one of those that is an extremely rare item and that has no substitute, so it's a different thing if, for instance, what you're comparing was a what's an example of an item with a wide roll range in Path of Exile that you can think of that's quite rare.
the old attribute stacking helmet for Omni. the Black Sun Crest. That has a really
That's a good
wide reward
example,
range.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, like, you could get one of those that, for those of you that don't know, this item has 3 independent rolls that run from 5 to 15%, and it's generally considered good if those add to 40 or more. But it's not a very rare item. So if you had, say, if you had one that was 36%, you might use that for a while and aspire to get one that's 43, 44, 45%. But you're not going to go straight out of your way and buy the 45% because you just get the cheaper substitute until you've tested that the build is for you.
Yeah.
And I would assume that that will be the case for anything that's got a budget substitute. You use the budget substitute for a while, and yeah, okay, the budget substitute you've got no resale on, but you just get rid of it and you replace it. But for things that have got no substitute, like the Squire in Path of Exile, those are going to be really affected hard by something like the last Epoch Merchant's Guild.
Thankfully, in Last Epoch, the way that the uniques work, I don't know if you know how the uniques work, but they can drop with like quote unquote legendary potential. And if like let's say like this item, this unique, it drops with like 3 LP, right? You can take a different item and slam 3 of those affixes on that item onto the legendary item, and that's what I would say would be like investing into the build. While just buying the normal unique without LP would be like the I just want to mess around with it, right? And we do definitely have that system in Last Epoch. But yeah, uh, I think that's going to be it today, though. I want to thank you, Sir Gog. Thank you for coming on and having an enlightening discussion with me and giving me some of your Path of Exile experience, so that we can kind of talk about these trade issues in more of a like a like a researched light instead of just being like it's so bad or whatever, right?
Who knows? Maybe it is so bad, but yeah, it's one of those things that you always want to think with anything about trade. Always think, what are various types of min maxes going to do with this, and have that in your mind, because any trade system can get broken by someone determined to do it.
Oh yeah,
But the ways that they fall apart have different flow and effects to other players.
exactly. Yeah, I want to thank you for coming around, Mr. Sirgog. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun.
If you want to check out Mr. Sirgog, I'll be leaving his link down below for his YouTube channel. He does a lot of Path of Exile commentary content, and he does a very good job. Now, with all that being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye.